Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Carol Ha. I'm the curator of contemporary Asian art here at the Freer and Sackler Galleries. Since roughly 2012, 2011, we've been having more exhibitions, an ongoing series of exhibitions and programs that feature or somehow address our growing collection of photography from across Asia. And I'm very pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, Sunil Gupta. Brief biography. He received his master's at the Royal College of Art in London and has been deeply involved with independent photography as a critical practice for many years and from many viewpoints as an artist, an educator, and curator. Currently, he is a visiting professor at the University for the Creative Arts in Farnham in the United Kingdom and visiting tutor at the Royal College of Art in London and at the Institute of Design in Ahmedabad. Sunil's deeply moving and thought-provoking portraits and fictional photo essays on race, migration, and issues affecting the LGBTQ communities have been widely exhibited and published. His work is seen in many important group shows at the Pompidou and at the Tate. His latest book, in collaboration with photographer Charan Singh, titled Delhi, Communities of Belonging, was published in 2016, and his most recent exhibition, Dissent and Desire, is on view in Houston just now. Sunil also comes fresh from curating the FotoFest Biennial, which just opened last weekend in Houston, so if you happen to go through Houston, do stop by both of those exhibitions. Tonight, he will first start by providing some background and an overview of his multifaceted photographic practice and really show us through his work how the power of image can really challenge society. And after his talk, we will have a brief conversation and then open it up to your questions. So without further ado, Sunil, thank you.
Oh, thanks, Carol. I'm just going to put my clock on so I know what's happening. Okay, so we'll just go straight into it. And it's not doing it now. No? Okay. Which one? Is that one? That's what I was told of. Okay, so this is where I started in Montreal as a young teenage immigrant from India, where my Indianness was relatively useless in my high school and my early college years. Nobody knew where India was. But luckily, gay liberation happened, and I embraced it wholeheartedly and began to document the early activism. So that's there we go. Okay, I'm just going to press it really hard. And we had publication, and I kind of did the pictures. It was a hobby became my role. I made it my role, and I taught myself how to print and process while I was doing this. So for me, the activism became a kind of reason why the photography came about. And kind of I inadvertently took a bunch of pictures of like me and my friends that has become the basis of an exhibition, a historical exhibition that I'm now doing for Toronto for April. So after that, I very soon found myself in New York in the mid-70s. where I dropped out of an MBA program and I went to the New School and studied with Lisette Model and Philippe Holzman and documented street life, especially Christopher Street, where my photography got a little bit of a brushing up, let's say, from the whole photo scene that I ran into, 50 galleries and all that stuff happening. It was quite amazing. But my parents very soon discovered that I had not gone to the MBA program, and since they were still paying, I was yanked out of New York, and then in the end I persuaded them that I would go to England, where it was much cheaper actually than to go to photo school. And so while I was there, these kind of things began to happen. Whoops, going too fast. Okay, so that was in the earlier show. What I meant to point out was that this kind of idea of fiction evolved from Montreal, actually, where I lived in a relatively, as I discovered much later on after I left for New York and London, that Montreal was a very small, cozy world of 5 or maybe 7 gay bars. So every night we'd see the same people. So even if we didn't know them, we gave them fictional characters and names and backstories, and so me and my buddy would hang out with a beer all night and gossip about these fictional people that were standing around us. And then we turned this into a mixture of photography and writing. My friend was interested in poetry, and I took the pictures, and there was a short series of these fictional characters. And so the work has sort of vacillated between documentary and fiction. And the fiction, though the style of the fiction has remained documentary, this was part of a big documentary project in London around Gay Switchboard. But in London in the mid-'80s, I came out of the RCA into what was, I guess, best described as the culture wars of the '80s around race and representation. And there was a notion of something called black arts. And I made a historically very significant choice not to go to the dealers and to Cork Street, but to go across the river to the town hall and become involved with public policy and think about culture in a much broader sense. Also in the early '80s, I began for the first time to return to India. I hadn't been back to India, having left as a teenager. I went back as an adult, as a gay adult. And so while I was there, I was actually trying to shoot documentary stories about institutional poverty in the countryside. So I spent most of my time out there, but I went through Delhi, like the big city, and then so of course this question of, well, what's it like for gay men in the city came up, and I discovered that nobody wanted to talk about it, nobody wanted to be in the picture, and so the picture making became very problematic. So this fictional idea came to the rescue, so we kind of faked this kind of picture. This was my documentary project that I did it was an investigation of a village in Rajasthan and the way it was divided by caste. So after I left the RCA and I waited for curators to come and none came, so another kind of activism became to just do your own shows. So that's what we did. This is the first photography exhibition I co-curated. It was an LGBT one as it happened. Well, L and G only back then. And it was very diverse, as you can see. We were very PC. It's Black, Asian, Greek, men, women, everything we could think of, including a kids workshop. The workshop were high school kids which we did for the school board, which was a labor-controlled radical organization, our school board. But those were the Thatcher years, and she, of course, shut everything down. And so in between, I did some photography projects, usually around things that were happening to me. One thing that happened to me is that my big long-term relationship ended after 10 years, which was a big shock. I didn't think it was, I don't know why, I thought it happened to other people. I wasn't like expecting it to happen to me. And so I was ill-prepared. And so I thought, I went out to meet other gay couples to figure out how they managed to stay together. And I used the camera as an excuse, and I made 30 portraits like these of couples. Oops. And so that earlier picture, sorry, I'm having trouble with this thing. Oh yeah, so then I survived doing this kind of magazine work. And sometimes, not always, mostly it wasn't like this. Mostly it was pretty straight. My first job was Miss UK. But I would get work related to my cultural, racial interests. So in interesting magazines, the first picture, this one, was in a story in Good Housekeeping. And the other one was in a social issues magazine. But then I got a commission from the Photographers Gallery to take, from this exhibition, to go back and rework the fictional gay men in India pictures in Delhi, which I did like that, with a bit of text, which was documentary in the sense that it came from interviews. So that was kind of more real. It was called Exiles, and it was my goal to place it somewhere in the cultural mainstream. Oh, and I'm very happy to report, so this has been bought by MoMA last year, so this has become there, because when I was doing all of this, I couldn't find any reference. There was like zero reference in the library to anything Indian and gay. The two things together didn't seem to exist. So it's like I had no cultural history at all, either in India or here. So in the Photographers Gallery, it passed without consequence, but the same pictures, many years later, this is now the end of the 90s, 16 years later, turned up, we put them up in a Indian part of London called Southall, and it caused a huge fuss. The Indians in Southall didn't like them. They said I was lying. There was no homosexuals in India. I'd invented this, blah, blah, blah. And they closed the center down altogether and fired the director. So just quickly, this was black art. It was something I got very involved with, organizing, going to meetings, lobbying the government, finally lobbying the Arts Council of England, with the public funding body. We made an argument that 5% of the UK is not white. We wanted 5% of the cultural budget. We want the money because you're not spending it. We said, where are the black photographers or the photographers of color? And they said there aren't any. They would say that because apparently there weren't any because there was no study on them. They said, write a report and research them, find us, point out some. So a lot of work initially was just to unearth it. So these kind of things happened just to unearth that there were such people and put them on display. So this was one of the earliest black exhibitions. So black in our case was post-colonials, so basically anybody who had been one of England's colonies, started with Ireland and back in those days, was black. So, but in realistic terms, it ended up being people of African, Caribbean, and South Asian descent primarily. There were some East Asians, mainly Chinese, but numerically they didn't constitute a large enough group. Now, half the Indians didn't think they were black, so from the South Asian point of view, we did have a bit of a problem because the community didn't think it was black. So people like me were running around saying we're black, and they were saying, no, we're not. So there was So I made work like this. It's just sort of responding to my times. So Margaret Thatcher's government also introduced this terrible law called Clause 28. And so I documented the demonstrations, and then I made artwork like that with fake couples and bits of real documentary pictures from the demonstrations, and a poem by the person I was seeing at the time. Oops, and I did a lot of work around race and photography like that, and HIV, of course, that came into the fray. And we started an organization that was a kind of lobbying group, or kind of for advocating photographers of Asian and African descent, called Autograph. It's a group it's an organization that still exists in London and still functions, been quite successful. So our first exhibition was auto portraits, with again this idea of initially you have to just reveal yourself, and like here we are. And we had one American because we wanted to show that we were global. Because the whole race problem gets inverted if you think globally, because there's actually more Indians and Asians than anybody else in the world. So if you think about the whole world, and the whites become the minority. And so anyway, so we started with the US because we thought we had a natural affinity because of language with the racial issues over here. So you'll see there's Lyle Ashton Harris here. Lyle Harris is Lyle Ashton Harris, who's now become quite well known here. Oops. So there were publications. I began to do more curating, simply because nobody else was doing it. This was an early show about Asians who live in Britain. It was a survey, so I was hired by the gallery to research this, because there was no primary research at all. I had to literally go around, find the people, and find pictures under people's bed and say, we're going to show these. So there's a range of people, you know, from this picture here is a performance artist, really, so it's a picture of his performance. But there were some fine artists who'd been to art school, and there were some school kids who were in a school's workshop. This did very well. It toured all over England and came to the Vancouver Art Gallery, where it caused a big fuss, because the local people of color in Vancouver said that the Vancouver Art Gallery was using its race quota by importing Brits and not dealing with the local Canadian problem. Along the way, I made a show about my family's migration to Canada. There are 20 pictures like that, and it's what my mother was saying underneath. It's the kind of ironic comments. This is in the Canadian, they used to have something called the Canadian Museum of Photography, which has become now part of the National Gallery of Canada. Oops. Okay. So this was an idea I brought to the Photographers Gallery. We had the poster of the show, and this is the book. And so by now I thought we should have a book, because a lot of the 80s has disappeared. There's no documentation of it. So here we got a publisher involved. And because this was Autograph in its early days, when it was just me and somebody else doing the work for the collective, and there was an English computer called Amstrad. You could hardly see the screen, so we had to produce a newsletter. It was very handy having the newsletter, because you could talk about things. And then I went to an AIDS meeting, and I met somebody there, and she and I decided we want to do an exhibition. We didn't want to lie on the road, so the other people in the meeting said that was very bourgeois of us. You know, we should go and lie down on Wall Street rather than make art exhibitions. But we made an art show. We made this. It was very British, because there had been a lot of American shows, but our situation was different. So basically, we'd come up with the idea, then go to the funders, and then find the galleries. That sort of became a skill that I developed. And I stopped doing the commercial work then. And we did a book. This was a piece in the book looking at the media at the time, the kind of rhetoric of AIDS in the British media. And then something called INEVA got started in England, which was black arts as applied to visual arts. So they got funding to focus on a kind of a global way on new international visual art. It was, INEVA was the short form of it. And it began with 3 franchises, so 2 curatorial ones and 1 publishing one. The publishing one is a journal called Third Text by Rashid Arain, and Eddie Chambers and I got the curating ones. And so I started my one with this exhibition. And so I did that for the next 14 years. It became one of my main activities. Other than making my own artworks, I was kind of doing the 2 things. But the goal of these exhibitions was to bring practitioners of mainly the Commonwealth countries, I would say, into some kind of mainstream British cultural arena. So we would produce exhibitions, research them, and put them on with British galleries, and they would tour. The idea was they would at least have 2 or 3 venues. And so the ideas came from different places. Divine Facades was my idea. It was a kind of response to the demolition of the Barbary Mosque in 2002, and there was this terrible crisis in India where this mosque was destroyed. So I thought if we looked at it through the architecture of religious sites in India, that would make it palatable, and then we could talk about this conflict. Because every site, it's a bit like Jerusalem, every Indian mosque is sitting on a temple, obviously. They didn't go and build it somewhere else. They just, when they took over, they built the mosque where the temple was, sometimes with the same material. So now, it's become very contentious because every religious group is claiming a physical site that they all have claim to, in a sense. So, and so I carried on doing bits of my work in there. I made an extended series called Trespass when England first joined the EU. This is the beginning. So there was a huge debate when they went in, having a big one now with leaving, when they went in. So us migrants were very anxious that if England joined the EU, there would be like a fortress Europe, and then what would happen to our status? Because the status of Commonwealth migrants was always separate, so we had I have certain rights in Canada because the Queen is still the head of Canada. You see, she's not the head of the EU, but because of you still see her on the stamp in Canada. So Canadians can vote there, Indians can vote there because of the Commonwealth connection. Anyway, I found my name in Germany, which was very exciting. It's a soap powder. Everybody heard of me, because I spent my whole life spelling my name out. There it was in all the supermarket shelves. Also, I discovered, I think the Apple scanners had come out. So I was very excited. I parted company with traditional, like that kind of photography. And I took a snappy camera to Berlin, shot lots of things that were interesting, gave them to the chemist, and then got back little prints and scanned them at whatever it was, to get low res, whatever they were. And then these things were 10 feet across, and they were pixelated and colorful. They were just marvelous, I thought. And then this was in response to my HIV diagnosis, which I tried to stay away from, but then I came back to it. It's a series of diptychs with my body, with the virus, and these gay nightclubs that was rather odd in England. As the HIV crisis grew, the gay nightclubs became more and more turned into sex clubs. So you kind of entered, and then you dropped your trousers right at the door. And So I shot them in the day. So they had their doors closed. So it became kind of ambiguous about whether I was allowed in or out. It was very funny because some of its patrons didn't recognize them. They'd only seen them in the night. So they didn't know what they looked like in broad daylight. So, well, I'm trying to change this. Yeah. And so this diptychs things kind of came about, and I did this thing about homelands, because I've lived in Canada and New York and or this side of the US and India and London. So I made a piece trying to bring it together, because it's a perennial question of where's home. And so essentially they feel very comfortable, all of them, to me. And actually, personally, I think home is really in your head, but we can get into that if you want the conversation. Then I went to live in India, where there was nothing happening with photography. So I got very involved in trying to make something happen. So research shows started a magazine because there was nowhere to have a discourse. I was very keen that there's something in print. And although everybody said it should be on the internet, but we produced this in print in Delhi, 2,000 copies, and we would leave them in university cafes and various places where young people collected. We wanted people to encounter photography in print. And I modeled it on camera work in London, which I used to be part of once. And so we could look at history. You see, this is an interesting picture. This is Margaret Bourke-White, flanked by Sunil Gupta, and another member of the Communist Party of India. Because as some of you might know, Bourke-White was taken around India by Jana was her guide. I'm going to go very fast. So these are portraits of LGBT people in Delhi, which been doing over around 2010 for a few years, that have been shown in various places. I became the poster for a modern art exhibition in Spain. So I was quite excited. India went from, oh, we don't mention it in the 80s, to, oh, it's okay to have it on the poster. It came a long way very quickly. Because I find India and China is very different. China has always been legal to be gay, but they can't talk about it. No pride parades, no big public display. In India, it's illegal, but you can say everything. You can have gay pride, and you can announce you're gay from the rooftops, and nothing happens. So it's odd differences. Also in India, then I had a studio, so then I made a series around the Pre-Raphaelites. I'd gone back to India to live, you see, because I turned 50, and I thought the Black Arts Project had kind of been overwhelmed by the YBA project, in the 90s. So by the early 2000s, what I thought I was doing felt exhausted, you know. So I thought it was a good time to leave. I thought if I'm going to India, I should work, not just go and retire in Goa or something. So I wanted to go when I was still able to do things. Oops. This was Click. This was the big survey show of contemporary Indian photography that I'd researched for Vadera Art Gallery, the one you went to, Brian, in Delhi. Because again, there was no information, so it was word of mouth and going door to door, trying to find them. And there they are. So there was just one or two pictures of each. It's not the scale of what's happening in Houston. It had to fit into one gallery, so everybody only had one or two pictures. It fed into this more historical show that happened at the Whitechapel. So here, this came from a discussion I had with the Whitechapel. But here we felt, I also thought that historically one should think of India as those three countries, because that's what they were. I mean, you can't talk about 1850 to now with just the current political borders, because it doesn't make sense, because there was movement of, people were living across the whole of the three countries. Yeah, okay. I think the whole idea of India is kind of, it's a British sort of idea. As a nation, you know, it didn't have those borders that we see now. Anyway, so Sun City was complete fiction. It's a reworking of La Jetée, a film by Chris Marker, which you might know. And I located it in this gay bathhouse in Paris with an Indian protagonist. And it got me into, I showed this in Delhi. I made it to be shown in India. You can't see any genitals. But still, some people thought it was too provocative, and so the police were called and it was shut down, and it was a big drama. And basically, I was looking for my border or margin, and that was it. So that terminated my stay there because I spoke to a lawyer. I know this became, you know, I was doing it in a kind of academic way, but the lawyer said this was quite serious, that they're saying this is obscene, this is criminal. I mean, you end up in court or in jail. So I thought, oh, okay. And then also all the galleries, nobody would show it, and it became like a difficult problem. But the gallery did produce a monograph, though, the same Madeira gallery, where we put queer on the title, and they were fine with that. So this is so if I kind of began with that representation of politics, meaning shoot a picture of the people marching, like you might do in Washington next week, to this ending of now we have the politics of representation, and it varies from east to west. In the pre-Raphaelite pictures, there's a lesbian couple with their baby boy, and the boy is naked, legs akimbo, and nobody here will show it because you get arrested for doing that here. So I guess different places have different, but you can show it in India. They don't mind naked babies. So that's the book that just came out, and I've run over time, but I'm going to end in a minute. Of course, sorry, I'm going on. This is FotoFest, that's happening right now, which has over 800 pictures in 47 artists. It's a huge show. And this is our show that's on right now, which is about LGBT people in Delhi, 17, 18 characters and their lives. I wanted to leave it at that. So this is a quote from the show, actually, from one of the characters in our show. And it's something odd happened in India, and it missed laptops. You know, it missed the laptop revolution. They were too expensive for Indians, but it got mobile phones. So 800 million people have a mobile phone. It's quite staggering. They missed lesbian and gay identity politics. They didn't have lesbians and gays. They were all invisible and hiding and not saying anything. But suddenly, since about 10 years ago, they've all turned queer. So queer is fine. Everybody's saying queer, so like this. So this is this Indian woman in Delhi. That's her view, you know. So I'll leave you with that. So that's where we are, or I am at the moment.
We're going to give them mics because we're recording the talks.
One of my hearing aids conked out.
All set?
In case you want to change.
Ah, okay.
So I'll just pat her on just a little bit. But it was interesting to note that an important part of writing this contemporary history of photography in places like India has been the publication of texts like Camera Work Delhi. And you might have noticed on the slide that Sunil had also worked with Gauri Gill. Gauri Gill is somebody who we have featured, I think it was now 2 years ago already, and whose works are in our collections. And she was another example of somebody who was who found it essential to publish the images, so that the existence of text along with images became so integral. Because, as I was saying, photographers like you, Gauri Gill, who has been involved in this museum, the importance of text, the importance of preserving that history where a history doesn't exist. So I was just mentioning that I find that interesting and also important. I wanted to just dive into a topic we started discussing, and that is in looking at the arc of your career in photography. As you said, you dove straight into the culture wars of the 80s, and you've seen many sort of permutations, the sort of back and forth, different audiences either rejecting or accepting your images and your works. Clearly now, as you exhibit in the States and even in India, there has been a significant reactionary turn. Have you felt that in your work, and how? Has reception sort of shifted? Have you found yourself coming back to some elements of the 80s? Maybe some commentary on how this is sort of shifting atmosphere towards identity politics, culture politics certainly, and difference.
It's definitely had an impact in the sense that I think in the early 2000s when I went to India, the social climate was very hopeful for change and liberalizing. They'd had 10 years of economic liberalizing, and they were now looking forward to a social liberalizing, because we have in India a generation that's under 25, a very large group of people who haven't experienced the before. I mean, they've only experienced economic liberalization in their own lives. So they're used to having jobs, having money and disposable income and all of that. And having that, they also want to have social freedoms. And they're impatient. So it felt like quite hopeful. With the present regime, the clock's been turned back. Socially, it's pro-big business. It wants to be pro-big business, but like really backward in every other way. So that's very unfortunate. So it's made cultural production one of its prime targets. So some states are rewriting history books. They want to rewrite history so that Indian mythology is being taught as historical fact. They want to have a say in, they've appointed all their own people to educational institutions, to museum directorships. So they're literally changing the landscape of cultural production. It kind of made it impossible for me to function, because I'd gone there to make work in India, about India, for India, and then if you can't really show it, I've gone back to the old model of living in a more liberal Britain and then flying into India and making something and then bringing it out, which is not ideal. And then similarly, I suppose, in this country, things have gone the way they have gone, although culture seems relatively more protected. Meanwhile, I did have some unfortunate conversations in Houston with some of the patrons and funders of our activity, who are serious gun-toting Republicans. So, there's a kind of double-edged thing to the arts here too. Where does the money come from? We're sitting here in Sackler, so I teach in a building called Sackler, and they want to change the name. So, and this is in London. Like that. So we have our own contradictions here, but at least for the moment. I feel that's safest in the UK, despite the Brexit thing happening. At least we're kind of legally covered for now. Although I think the Indian experience of legalizing homosexuality and then 4 years later doing a U-turn reminds us that where we're sitting, the law is in our favor today, but it can be turned around tomorrow.
I'd like to go back to a question that was asked of you over 20 years ago and see if your opinions have changed. But you were asked once, given the range of activities in which you engage, whether you found yourself to be more useful or effective as a curator, as an educator, or as an artist. And it seems that you are focusing a lot more on yourself as an artist. So I wonder if your opinion has changed over the years about which of your activities or which part of your practice you feel engages you the most.
Okay, so I think, yes, what's happened is that I feel like I've become isolated because in the 80s when we started and in the 90s when we were still not so old and still idealistic, I thought really that in England we were at the front of a wave. And then I looked behind and there wasn't any wave. Like there were no more people coming through. You know, I thought we had begun the work of excavating Black and Asian practice where I was, and then it turned out that there were hardly any people behind you, and if there were any, they were running away from the idea of identity politics in their practice, because it's like the way women artists turned away from feminism. They don't want to be women artists, they're just artists. Similarly, I found Black and Asian artists who were younger ones really didn't want to be part of this thing called Black arts. Didn't want to be politically engaged in that way. And what everybody was focused on after the YBAs was money and the art market. And that's not what we were about. And so there wasn't this body of people, you know, that you were kind of, this community that you would, it turned out to be imaginary, that there wasn't this thing behind. So I began to feel like my classroom is full of young white British kids, and that ultimately I'm furthering the glory of England. And they're all white. And so, not that there's something wrong with that, but why should that be me? You know, like I've done all. So then being in India made the race thing easier, because then I was in the right place. And then I began to teach in schools, meaning secondary schools, so then I had 7th, 8th, 9th graders. And then I taught in a non-English speaking art school in Hindi, so that was really challenging. Because by the way, of course, the whole history of photography is in English, so I'm taught in English everywhere, including India. So if you don't speak English, you're completely cut out from it. You have no access to this, which is curious, isn't it? And so then I went to teach at NID, you know, in Ahmedabad. And that's a kind of flagship national school. And I felt like I could, so I got involved with setting up an MFA and gave it time and energy and so on, because I feel there can't be an Indian photography, say in our case, until the discourse is there, and that there won't be a discourse unless the schools are there. So I feel higher education is a key component of building cultural, you know, edifices or whatever. Yeah, because even that Gauri Gill generation has all gone to ICP in Stanford. And if you notice in our current show, you know, there's a lovely young man called Tenzing Dakpa who's Tibetan. And his work is saying, you know, I've been to RISD. It's not saying isn't it? It's not
It
saying
has
I'm
a
living
street
in
photography,
India, but it's because it's RISD. Which is fair enough, because India's like becoming this hybrid. So maybe they'll find something there. So in my own, what your question then is that, so I've retreated into just my own artistic practice, because the larger social question relied on public engagement of higher education and public funding in the arts, which in India was not available. So I've said my piece over the decade to people in India and in Delhi. I've been to meetings where the public sector has called meetings with the private sector. So what I mean is that a museum and the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi, and those directors get together, invite private gallery people and the Indian art market people and some freelance oddbods like me and say, look, we can't do it. We can't, our hands are tied, the government doesn't give us the funds. We have a staff of 50 whose main job is to be obstructive and not put on any shows. They can't cope, and so they've literally handed it over to the private sector, which I think, from the kind of knowledge we have of the private sector in the West, is a deadly thing. You can't, or at least in Europe, we don't leave it to the private sector. For example, the Al-Kazi Foundation of Photography, that collection, which was in New York and London, was taken back to India. It's a private collection, and in that process, at one point there was a family row. And as some people here might know, some of the family came to New York with the view to actually sell the whole thing, because they just want the money. It's only there because one family member is very keen to hold it. The rest, what do they care about photography? They just want to cash it in if they can.
I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. This will be my last question so that others can chime in. Back to you as an artist. Your projects move from a kind of a documentary style, even within these fictional photo essays, to something like Sun City, where the scenarios are more constructed. Is that, can you speak a little bit about this sort of move towards these constructed scenes and these constructed narratives, which you then would somewhat stage and photograph, or the collaging of images that happened after Germany? Can you speak a little bit about that shift in your practice?
Yeah, I think when I was first starting out, and I was self-taught at first, and I taught myself through those wonderful Time Life books from the early 70s. I don't know if you remember them. They were called Camera, Print, and stuff like that. And anyway, so basically, I came out of college art photography school thinking I want to be the next kind of, humanist photojournalist, something in the mold of Eugene Smith or something. I was thinking classic 1950s, black and white, committed, Minamata kind of thing. I needed to find which is why I went to India for over 2 years to investigate poverty, Because we're sitting here thinking, oh God, they're very poor out there. And I thought, well, let's find out why, and why, what's going on. But then when I came to the world of work, I was told by picture editors in London and in New York, the New York Times people saying, oh, that's all gone. Television does that. We don't do that in photography. What you do is make glamorous portraits of celebrities for Sunday magazines. That's what you do. And since for my works out with Miss UK, it was deeply distressing and disappointing. So, and also at the same time, academically, the schooling had questioned the truth aspect of the documentary. It had come into disrepute anyway. So, so the idea of but I liked the appeal of the documentary feel of the picture and the kind of way audiences would respond to them so easily, So then I like this kind of fake, this kind of, constructed documentary, if you like Exiles, which some people have told me they're very disappointed that they were constructed. and not real. Some people think that they're real, that I was actually hiding behind the bushes and jumped out at the right time, which is how I started doing exiles, and you can do it like that. But then I thought, I'm just exposing a whole bunch of probably married homosexual men who don't want to be exposed, in this way. So, and also, before all of this, I guess, somewhere in my consciousness, growing up in India, before coming to the West and all of this, we didn't go to art galleries, we went to the cinema. And the kind of cinema I grew up with was Bollywood. It was big, blockbustery, very colorful, very melodramatic, and quite fake, in a sense. It's just that I never had the budget for it, so whenever an opportunity, because Sun City was made possible because the Pompidou Centre paid, and I was able to have a production company. It was literally, I had a producer and a crew and all of that.
Right, with Dissent and Desire with Charan, there are some very saturated images. I mean,
Yeah, so there also, that's kind of more documentary, but it's like anti-documentary because there's no decisive moments and there's no moments of like great pathos or anything. People are just being very ordinary. It's kind of deliberately not dramatic, if you see what I mean. It feels like the queers of Delhi having a very normal, ordinary time.
Should I open up to any questions that anyone?
Many of the images had Madeira Gallery at the bottom. Can you say something in general about your relationship with galleries in India or in New York, for example, Sepia, or the galleries that you had to deal with? How you had some disappointments? They've been supportive as Madeira has been supportive.
Yeah, well, actually I came to them rather late because having turned my back on them when I graduated in '83, I didn't come to, I came to them by accident. Actually in this country, in New York, because before Sepia, there was this guy who ran a gallery called Admit One. I don't know if anybody remembers it. He wasn't an art person. I think he was he came from a very different profession, but I think his wife was a doctor or something. They lived in Brooklyn or somewhere. Anyway, for some reason, he decided to open this photography gallery in Chelsea, no less, before Chelsea became the Chelsea we know. And Ram Rahman, who is one of the Indian photographers, is in all these shows, who I've known a long time, who lived in New York half his life, introduced us, and he thought, the guy should sell your pictures. And I had no idea what that meant, and I never made them for sale, and I made them for a different kind of grant-funded thing, and after that they rested under my bed. And then so we had some little shows, and then he actually saw something, and I think Houston, who am I thinking of? The curator from Houston. Who'd been there for many years, who retired.
Oh, Anne
yeah.
Tucker.
Yeah.
Ah.
So Anne Tucker came and bought 2 pictures suddenly. So then it's like, a museum bought the pictures. I was sort of very not on my radar, And I don't know if you know Anne, she's very effusive. She was very, I got to know her. She chatted a lot, and I'd sort of. Anyway, I'd come to realize that curators were not the enemy, because that's how we used to treat them. There were all these white curators who were like the enemy. No, because they didn't know anything about you or where you came from.
Right.
It was their ignorance that was holding back the whole thing. Anyway, but actually it was the trustees. Anyway, I came to that realization later in life. So Anne became a friend eventually. But then unfortunately you had 9/11. And the very next day, this guy called me in London and said, look what happened, I'm closing, no one's going to buy pictures. He shut shop. And except I had, because we're all very low budget, I had flown in with these pictures, and he had this stack of prints, and then they couldn't be sent back to me because they had no paperwork had gone in with them. They can't cross borders. So they got stranded in New York, and Essa was doing sepia with Al-Qazi at that point, in that space that they had. And she said, oh, well, okay, I'll just store them. So she stored them. And that's how that sort of got going. Because I first met Essa and Al-Qazi, old man Al-Qazi, at one of the Houston FotoFests in the early 90s. And I wouldn't speak to them because they were the private sector. You know, I was part of something called Oracle. Oracle is this informal secret society of photo curators in the US, but they belong to museums, and the private ones are not invited.
And they meet.
They meet
They meet
secret,
annually.
yeah, and they don't record what they say.
Sorry, just very quickly, your archive, you have a significant archive then of the history that you've put together.
Yes.
How will you how will you keep that into what?
It's very chaotic, actually, because I've been moving around.
Yeah.
But the bulk of it's managed to be stored by an ex of mine, because it's a huge house. So actually, my relationships went the wrong way. I started with a Swiss banker and ended up with a very broke Indian. I should have done it the other way. The Swiss guy, he's preserved it as far as he could. So it was very scattered, but I managed finally to physically bring it together. So I'm now starting to try to deal with it in some more reasonable way. For the first time in my life since last July, we rented a loft in London, which we can live in, and so everything I've got is under one roof and accessible. So that first image I started with is the subject of the next show, because I could access all of this material from the 70s. It's my coming out show from Montreal. So there's 65 pictures going to be open in the Contact Festival in Toronto. Meanwhile, Mark Seeley, who runs Autograph nowadays in London, approached me to do a retrospective, because I think he thinks I'm going to die soon. He wants to do it before I die. So he's approached, so it's going to start in the Ryerson Imaging Centre in Toronto, which is a very big space, and then come to the Photographers Gallery. But that won't be till 2020. But in Houston, I was having a chat with some people about archives, because somebody asked me, what about your archive? I think I'm 65 and people are worrying on my behalf that I'm not going to be around much longer. I didn't think so, but it seems like, well, I feel like I have all these things to do yet, new things to do. But so he told me about that he organizes, he's a go-between, so he'll take my archives and flog them to Stanford or somebody.
Right.
And I didn't know that kind of thing happened, because we were thinking in England where to put our archives. And I've thought, again, in my 80s way, we go to the state and we get money and we have a kind of LGBT archive or something, or an Asian archive. But they're always very tricky, because then where do they sit, the physical things.
Well, and actually, sorry, just to clarify, my question was less about, less pessimistic, and it was more related to this, perhaps the burden of representation or identity politics, is that sometimes photographers feel that their archives belong within a particular national space. And so I was curious, given comments that you've made on several occasions about home is where your head is, is where your mind is. So I was just curious about how you felt about the location of your archives.
Yeah, I don't feel nationalistic. I feel nations are a terrible idea. I don't know, they're a new invention. We didn't really need them. I don't feel like particularly emotional about a country or a flag or anything. Yeah, I mean, whenever I've gone somewhere else and I've realized that we've just been told lies about them because it suits the place that you've left, because like that. And I've been othered for so long that, when I was 9 or something, India had a war with China in '62, and I have slightly slanty eyes, my mother's Tibetan, and then suddenly in the playground, people were pointing at me, like, he's the chinky one, kind of thing. So, I've had this, and my mother was continuously being othered because she was Tibetan, in a good way, because, the Indians from the hot plains think people from the mountains with fair skin are marvelous. So that's another kind of, but there is a problem, like Indians in India also feel like, what about their archives? And so for example, with LGBT, I've gathered up a historian friend in India who's gay, just his personal photographic archives, because they're of his gay life that has been kind of hidden underground, never been seen, and there's no one in India to leave it with or give it to, who's capable or will want to. I mean, if families get a hold of this, they destroy it. This has happened in a number of cases, so that it was imperative to get them out of the country. Now that I got them out of the country, they're in London, but should they remain there? I don't know. They could be here if they were safer. Wherever they're going to be safe and looked after, that's the key thing, it seems to me. What's happened in London, I used to work with the Hall Carpenter Archives, which was a local LGBT oral history project. It was a NGO, it was a funded, like a town hall, like local funded organization, activist group. So we went around gathering histories. So when the funding ran out, the physical remains of it, the tapes and the photographs I made, all went to the London School of Economics library. And nobody can access it. You have to be a student. You have to have a proper bits of paper, like the LGBT people who are just walking the street can't see anything. So that kind of defeats our purpose. Right. Whereas Montreal has a state-funded archive.
Unlike the Smithsonian, we're open to our public for research. And we've gone over time, I'm very sorry. Unless there's a burning question, maybe we'll end it here. Is there? No?
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.